Hello, my name is Carrie, and welcome back to Wearables and Shareables. In today's video, we're going to be doing part 2 of the Mezzo Cardigan by the Pt.2 group. Of course, if you haven't seen part 1, go check that out. There'll be a link in the description, and I'll leave a link up in the info card as well. Now, last time, we were learning how to work rounds 1 through 3 of the pattern. But for this next part, we actually need to skip ahead and go to the end of round 7. So if you haven't worked all the way to the end of round 7, do that before checking out this video. At the end of round 7, the pattern is going to prompt you to do a gauge check. Now, you don't have to do anything separate. What you've already done is going to work as your gauge swatch. But there are some important caveats before we can get started in talking about the gauge. The first thing is that you want to check to make sure each side of your hexagon has 27 double crochet stitches from one corner to the next. So there should be 27 on this side, 27 on this side, 27 on this side, and so on. If you don't have 27 on each side, something has gone wrong in your pattern, and you may need to take things back to rework them. But if you do have your 27, then you are ready to measure for gauge. Now, gauge is an important thing to measure when you are working in a wearable pattern. If you are making something like a dishcloth or maybe a table runner, the gauge isn't always as important. But for a wearable pattern, it's important that you have the correct gauge so that when you have your final object, you know that it will fit you based on your measurements. Now, of course, this pattern is going to go into more detail than I can here in this video, so be sure to check out the pattern itself. Again, you can get it for free on the Make and Do Crew website, or you can pick up the ad-free pattern from Etsy. The first direction that we need to do is to find the center. And for me, that's pretty easy. I started with a magic circle, so I've got my tail of yarn coming out of the center there. And we're going to measure from the center to the outside edge. And we want that to be about 3.5 inches. So you can see here when I put my measuring tape from the center to the edge, I have 3.5 inches here. Now, of course, I can go around and measure all the other sides of my hexagon. They should be equal. So I should get about 3.5 inches on each side that I choose. Now, be careful, you're not measuring from the center to a corner. That's going to be a longer measurement. You can see if I put it to the corner, I'm all the way out to 5 inches. So you just want the radius from the center to one straight side. And that's going to be about 3.5 inches. The next place we need to measure is just this distance between one corner to the next. And for this, we're looking for about 7.5 to 7.75 of an inch. And you can see here when I lay my tape measure out, if I move my thumb, I have just about 7.5 there. If yours is slightly short, just make sure everything is laying flat. Hopefully it will line up to about 7.5 to 7.75 of an inch. And again, if I were to take another side and measure from corner to corner, I should get about 7.5. This one isn't laying as flat as the other one, but it's not too far off. Now, if I were getting a swatch where I had maybe only 5 inches, or if I have 8.5, something that's wildly off from the gauge mentioned in the pattern, you may need to rework your first 7 rounds. If your pattern is coming out with the exact perfect measurements like mine did, pretty close anyway, then you can continue using the hook size that you've been using. And for me, that was an H. And I think in the pattern, she suggests starting with a J. But I'm a very loose crocheter, so I knew that I would have to go down a hook size or 2 in order to get the correct gauge. Now, if you're a very tight crocheter, you may have to move up depending on what your gauge measurement is showing. So if your gauge measurement is spot on, just keep using the same hook. If your gauge is coming out where your hexagon is measuring too wide, then you may need to move down a hook size. If your gauge is measuring too short, then you may need to move up a hook size. And the other thing to consider is whether or not you have used the correct yarn weight. So in our last video, when I was showing you how to work rounds 1 through 3, I used a worsted weight yarn, and I used a 5.5 millimeter or I believe this is an I crochet hook. So the gauge here is going to be much different than this actual gauge swatch. For this gauge swatch, I used a DK weight yarn. So if I hold the two yarns next to each other, I'm not sure how well you can see it on camera, but this worsted weight, this green or minty color, is much fatter than my DK weight, this nice denim blue color here. So that in itself is going to cause the size of the project to increase because I'm using a heavier weight yarn and my hook size was bigger. So for me, this is the correct gauge. The next thing that I would do is make my identical hexagon for rounds 1 through 7, and then I would compare them to make sure that they are also the same size and that they also have their 27 double crochet stitches between each corner. And it's always good to double check that you do in fact have 6 corners to make a hexagon. Because remember, when we work the rest of the pattern, at some point we are going to be folding it so that we bring these corners together. Well, let me see if I can figure out which way it's supposed to go. I haven't marked my side numbers. There we go. So it's going to look something like this, where this will become the sleeve and this will become the back and the front and back of one side of the hexagon. And then of course we'll have the mirroring from the opposite hexagon on the other side. We'll seam them up the back to make our cardigan. So you can really use this hexagon technique to make a lot of different styles of cardigans with different stitch types. But if you wanted, you could make an entirely double crochet hexagon just by using, or cardigan, just by using this initial double crochet hexagon pattern. So I hope that helps you with your gauge. If you have any questions, leave them down in the box below and I'll be happy to help you out. Thanks. Bye.